welcome to the Learning Experience powered by CAST. I'm one of your hosts, Kelly Suding.
And I'm Luis Perez.
And I'm Brian Dean.
We are three educators here ready to break down barriers until learning has no limits. Let's do this.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Learning Experience powered by CAST. So excited for the conversation we're going to have today.
Oh, I'm stoked. I'm stoked.
Right, Brian?
Yes, I was stoked, brother.
We always love to bring an international audience to this podcast and an international perspective, and we're going to do just that today. So, Brian, I want to start with a question for you. What is your favorite?
Don't make it a hard one. I'm having a rough morning, brother. So don't make it a tough one on me.
I'll make it an easy one.
Okay, I'll take that.
Since it's an international podcast or episode today, what's your favorite country that you visited? Your favorite place. Could be your favorite place.
Yeah. So as you know, I lived overseas for a bit. So I have to tell you, I keep coming back to Indonesia. It was just a beautiful place to live. I lived, kind of traveled around Indonesia from Jakarta to Bali and to the Celebes Islands and Borneo, places like that. And I will tell you, my time there was just something magical. It was beautiful. It was different. I got to try durian fruit, which is exciting on its own in its own right, you know. But yeah, that was one of my most my favorite places to be. What about you, brother?
I've heard about that fruit and the smell when it.
You cannot. So you cannot eat it in an enclosed place by law. Like you cannot eat it indoor by law. That's rough.
Is there a disclaimer that says you got to be in an open space before you eat this?
Yeah, it's legally like you cannot eat this inside a building. You can buy it in a building, just don't open it.
Mine, I would have to say, was Australia. I really loved going to Australia. It was a long trip.
Yes.
But it was worth it just to see the wildlife. And of course, now that I'm into birding, if I were to go again, I would look at it with a different perspective, right? I think I would appreciate it more. Yeah. But even then, I really appreciated the warmth of the people and just appreciated the country and the culture. And so I would love to go back there for sure.
Yeah, I find Australia interesting that the people are so nice and so amazing, even though they live in a country where 95% of the animals there can kill you, right? So like it's always interesting to me that like they're just so like, you know, this is a great day, it's a good day, you know, I didn't get hit by any drop bears or I didn't get, you know, bit by like a venomous snake. It's cool.
And you know where they took me, my hosts, Brian, they took me to a center where they milked the spiders to get their venom. And so
I don't know if you can say that on a podcast.
They took me to this room and they opened up these curtains and there were a bunch of spiders on jars because apparently the venom is quite, strong. And so they have to take these steps to keep the venom or the anti-venom, I guess they develop it from the spider. So anyway, But this time I'll stick to birds. I'll try not to get bitten by any spiders or any snakes. But you're right. It's a beautiful and at least in the outdoors, you got to be careful there.
Right.
But you know what? Since we have our guests today that are coming to us from Europe, I also enjoyed my time in Germany.
Yeah.
And Poland, especially the food and traveling around, even though I didn't speak the language at all. Mm-hmm. But you know how it is. We find a way.
That's exactly it. I think that's probably like, not to jump in too much, but that's one of to me, traveling to a different country where you don't know the language is when you start to really understand universal design in a big way. Right? Like when I lived in Indonesia, I was 17 and I went there by myself, didn't know anything about language. I'm not good with languages. But the symbols that were there that were kind of universal symbols helped me navigate. But same thing, my family, my family's from the Netherlands, so I've been there quite a few times. But even then, I just don't have a head for language. But like the representation is still there in many different ways, and so I can navigate my way around. And I think that's just this incredible like real life experience of of universal design in many ways.
Yeah, I think my favorite thing that I've ever done is trying to get from Berlin to a town in Poland where I had a conference and not knowing either of those languages,
Right.
relying on gestures and pictographs and apps.
Right. And great
But
people.
and
That's
great
the
people.
other thing. Great people, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. The people
Yeah.
definitely make it. And speaking of great people,
Yes.
today we have two great people with us, right?
Ooh,
We have
we do.
Lukas and Stewart. So we're going to turn it over to them and learn more about their exciting work in the area around Germany. And so I'm going to turn it over to them. So let's do some quick intros. Let's
Right.
start with Stewart. Stewart, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing.
Yeah, what's going on,
Yeah, hi
gentlemen?
everyone. Yeah, thanks for inviting us to the show. Yeah, well, my name's not the most German name in the world. It's actually pretty Scottish. Stewart Campbell. You can't get more Scottish than that. But my
Yeah.
family actually went from Scotland to the U.S. in the 50s. And actually I'm American and I grew up there. I grew up in Los Angeles, studied in Idaho and Washington State, and then I went to Germany through an exchange program between the U.S. Congress and German Bundestag. And after that, I got kind of stuck here because I started to teach English to adult education. And that's how I entered into the educational field. And I taught in adult education, teaching EFL for a very long time. I decided to go back to study again because I kind of missed. I actually studied history before, and I wanted to teach it. So I went and studied again, and I got a master's degree, a second bachelor's degree, a master's degree. Did in-service teacher training here, and then after that, I started working at actually kind of special type of school that was what maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, which was quite interesting. And then I also got into research, did lots of research, and then that's how one of the reasons why I also kind of got into UDL as well. But I'm currently a lecturer of English or academic English at the University of Osnabrück in northern Germany. And yeah, that's a little bit about myself.
I
That's
love
great. And
it.
you're part of the club, man. You're part of the distinguished gentlemen that are follically challenged but have great beards.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you're on the newsletters just yet, but we'll get one sent out.
We'll get you on there. We'll get you a lifetime pass because
That sounds good.
we were joking with Lukas that he just has a temporary card, but apparently he's looking to join the club and get all the benefits. So
Well, I don't know if he's looking, but he says he's going to join the club eventually.
so Lukas, tell us a little bit about you. And one thing that you did when we were preparing for this episode, which I love, is such a UDL support, is you gave us a spelling or a phonetic spelling or a way to pronounce your name. So Fehlings, now I can pronounce it correctly, right? Hopefully.
Yes, totally correct. But it was Stewart. It wasn't me, to be honest, who wrote this information to you. Yes, my name is Lukas Fehlings, and I live in the south of Germany in Freiburg, which is next to the Black Forest, which is maybe well known in the US. And yes, in
Great cake.
Europe.
Great cake.
Sorry?
Great cake.
Yeah. And maybe it will get more known in Europe as well, since we reached the final yesterday in the UEFA Europa League in football for the first
All
time.
right.
So
Nice.
spot on Freiburg, the football club as well.
That's right.
And what I do is I work in the Special Education Support Center in Basel, which is in Switzerland. So I cross the border each day twice. And I used to be a special education teacher, and now I'm more in the support level active, yes. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
It's always important to mention that, football connection, because I know with my university, nobody knew about it until we reached higher in the rankings, right? And all of a sudden, people knew exactly where we were. So it's helpful in a way. It gets more attention to your university and gets people to, consider it as a place to study. So that's important. I'm glad you highlighted that. So let's take it back to the beginning for each of you, right? And let's think about how did you kind of discover UDL? What is it that drew you to it? What excited you about it? Because I know you're working with a larger team, but how did you find each other and make this connection and determine, we are like-minded people. We share a similar passion. Let's work together. So tell us a little bit. Let's start with you, Lukas. How did you two kind of start this journey?
My journey with UDL actually began while I was studying special education in Switzerland. And to be honest, at that time, it was more like one theory among many, because I was confronted with so many things whilst my studies. And it was years later, when I worked as a professional special educator, when it came back. And it clicked because it fitted perfectly with my beliefs about inclusion and with my beliefs about high quality education. And what excited me most about UDL is that on the surface it's very clear and practical, but there is a big depth in it. So you can
say that
dig
again. I
it.
love that.
And
That's absolutely it.
Yeah, and when I came closer to the framework, it completely changed my way of thinking, away from fixing the student to fixing the surrounding. And then I began exploring the subject. I read books by Katie Novak especially, and I visited some courses from her and yours from CAST. And yes, and during this process, I became curious about how there were other practitioners around in German-speaking areas. And the turning point was at the UDL Con, where Stewart and I were able to visit last year, because Lindsay invited us to connect online.
Yeah.
And there I realized this big community, which is around UDL. And they were talking about the UDL family, and we realized we have to have this in our German-speaking world too. And this is how we came together. And Stewart and his colleague, or our colleague Thomas Müller, they translated the framework in German. So this was one big step. And now we are a group, as you already said, and Mario Wörtsch from Austria and Thomas Müller, who's from Switzerland. Stewart and I, we are like kind of the heads of our group at the moment. And now we had, I think, 5 online meetings, and it began with 9. And now we are around 21 people from 6 different regions, in the German-speaking regions. So it's Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, South Tyrol, which is in Italy, where they speak German as well. And yes, that's how we came together. And we have several plans to go. So we have to finalize our statutes, which is like, maybe we can talk about it later on, which is a big thing, to bring all those different people from different countries together. And I think it was last week when we had a conversation with Lindsay and Jenna Greville.
Oh, yeah.
We created some ideas. So maybe one vision was to maybe have a German language track at the UDL Con next year in 2027. And there are big visions, and we have to get there step by step,
right,
as it goes with UDL. Yeah.
I love the fact, though, that you have these big visions, and that you're reaching out to other people, and you saw something, you captured something, even in an online fashion. You captured, you caught this feeling that UDL is something you got to kind of marinate in, right? Like, it comes off and it's just a theory at first, but as you sit within it and you think about it and you see its practical use, then all of a sudden it starts to churn up. Like, there's this movement, there's this can change the very way that I even began to think about my practice and what I could do in it. So and that's kind of where I come from as well. So I love the fact that you've reiterated that, and that your experience was really just this really kind of grassroots kind of feeling, or where it started.
And
I also want to hear Stewart's side. I want to hear how Stewart came to UDL, because that's always how I phrase it, is how did you come to UDL, not how did you start doing UDL. It's like, how did you come to this thing? So Stewart, please hit me with it.
Sure. For me, it was kind of an interesting path, because, like I said, when I went back to study again, 2010, like, this idea of inclusion, as kind of was a big topic at university, and they were kind of transitioning. And they saw the need to try to include more students, because Germany has a tracked school system that's is quite either you go here or there, and exclusion was rather the norm here. So they were trying to think about how the system's still there, but they were trying to think, how do you include more people? My experience was it kind of felt more like an add-on. It was a bit like, this is important, and then like in all the subjects I also had to kind of deal with it, but it was always like an extra chapter in a book or something like that. But it was never something that kind of like went through and say, hey, this affects all the stuff that we do, and not just like, oh, it's just just do this at the end of your lesson, and it's differentiation is good enough or something like that. So and then when I went back into teaching at schools, public schools, at the secondary level, then I was confronted with a lot of issues. I was like, I don't know how to really deal with this. Like, I remember one time at a parent-teacher conference night, a woman came in for a high schooler about 10th grade, and then she said, "How are you helping my daughter with her dyslexia?" And I was like, well, we gave her extra time. so I kind of realized, like, I don't feel prepared enough to deal with this. And during that time, I was in my in-service teacher training. I had a really, really good teacher trainer who was really motivated, and she actually had heard about UDL, and she introduced me to one of our seminars. We only dealt with it like for 20 minutes, and it was just a bit too much. It was like we didn't know how to deal with it, and you're just trying to survive anyways in these training processes. So I kind of just went on the back burner. And then later, when I was finished and I was teaching at a high school. I was right next door to a university where the one I actually studied at, and this university was kind of unique, and the school was unique because they actually, when they built this university in the 1960s, it's called Bielefeld University. Mm-hmm. They actually invited a guy named Hartmut von Hentig, who's a big name in like German pedagogy here, right. And he said, if I come to your university, then you have to give me a school, basically. So, and so there's a school there called Laborschule in German, or like a laboratory school. Right. And then the second part of it is called the Oberstufenkolleg. So it's kind of like, and you kind of mix some parts like of American school system with the German one there. And it's a really cool system. If you guys want to go online, check it out. It's called Laborschule. It's got really interesting concepts there. And I think we were lucky there because we had a lot more freedom in terms of the curriculum, because German has really strict laws about this is how many exams you have to do, and this is the type of, so there's a lot of systematic barriers here. And I had a lot more freedom there to start introducing things like, well, if I want to do like alternative ways of testing, like oracy, for example, right? Instead of the standard like ways of doing it, I can say, well, what about a podcast? Because a podcast, for example, is also dealing with like oral things and stuff like that. So I was already kind of introducing, I had the opportunity to do that. And I was also teaching adjunct as faculty in the EFL department to work with the students who want to become teachers, because I had experience. And I was like, well, I got to teach a class on, EFL. The idea was EFL inclusion. That's all they told me. I was like, well, okay. And so I started researching, and I found UDL again. And I was like, yeah, this all makes sense. And what I have to do now is just kind of help the students see, where do we actually then find, UDL and make connections into our subjects? Like, where do we actually see? We can also make connections to things we already know, for example, and that I found extremely helpful. Then, like when we talk about like things like autonomy, it's like this. We talk about learner autonomy with Henri Olek, and so so like this is a lot of the stuff we actually kind of know. You just have to kind of reframe it a little bit.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah, and before I turn it over to Brian for the next question, a couple of things that stood out to me. First of all, you said you met at UDL Con in person, right? And I want to highlight, we are having UDL Con as we're recording this. We're planning to have that event this summer. It's going to be virtual. So those of you that are in other parts of the world, right, where travel maybe from the German-speaking countries that we're talking about today may be a little bit difficult, but you can definitely sign on, right, and join us virtually. And so, again, that's the whole point of that conference, that event, is to really bring people together, just like you two have come together. And the other thing is, your experience is not unique, Stewart, right? Sometimes it's really easy to get overwhelmed at first. So we just tell people, you take this on like one little piece at a time, and just kind of build on it over time, which sounds like it's what you've done, right? As you needed different parts of UDL, you've brought them into your practice, you've gotten really comfortable with it, and then moved on to like, let me deepen my practice, right, over time. So I love to hear both of your experiences and how the two of you came together and now are doing some beautiful things in your broader area, right, that is influencing so many people. So really appreciate having you both on to demonstrate the connection.
I think that it's, like I always go back to the joys of Allah quote, and it's one of my favorites. And she said it to me, and it just kind of put everything in perspective. You can't boil the ocean, right? You just can't, right? But you can start one pot at a time, right? You can boil a single pot at a time. And I think that UDL, because it is such a big framework, in the sense that it encompasses so many different things, and there's so many design considerations within it. And we are, as educators, we're like, we want to fix things, right? And we want to do this thing with highest fidelity possible right out the gate. It becomes just incredibly overwhelming, to the point of like you get choice paralysis. Like, where do I go? How many choices do I put in? Like, all of these different questions. But if you start just where you see the need, right, and then that triggers another need, and that triggers you seeing another barrier, a systemic barrier here or that, then UDL becomes something that's far more manageable. And then it starts to become like what you were saying, Lukas, where it becomes like this foundational thing to my core belief around teaching and learning and what that means. But I also want to go back to the school you were talking about, Stewart. Like, this reminds me a lot, and I don't know, Louise, you know of this school, but there's a school here in the U.S. that John Mundorf is part of, who, if you don't know John Mundorf, he's a great guy. I call him the uncle of UDL because he's just a fantastic dude, gives you a huge hug every time you see him. And it's called PK Young, right? And they are also a laboratory school. And it sounds very much like your school, Stewart, where you were teaching adjunct, but also working in classrooms. And I think that's just an amazing model to work with, because you can dive into the theoretical side of it, but then you can also see where the practicality is and what that looks like. And does this theory informs practice, practice informs theory. It starts that cycle, which is an amazing one. So yeah, I'm super it seems like you both have just found this really great journey. So then I am going to just kind of put this forward. Like, we know that, UDL kind of originated really more in a U.S. Policy context, right? But as we've already discussed, there's there's a deeper meaning or deeper reach than that. But so you guys started translating the language of UDL 3.0 guidelines from English to German. But what are the challenges? Not just the language challenges, but really more. Are there difficulties with the translating of the concepts of UDL into the German-speaking kind of like educational landscape? And what do you find that's different there? I'll throw that out.
Maybe I should jump in. Yeah, maybe I should jump in there, because Thomas Müller and I were kind of the main ones working on the translations of the 3.0 document. And it was a very interesting job. I can say a lot about this, so if I say too much, to shut me up. All right. But like, one of the first things was, we actually sat there for a really long time, because it is, translation is not always like one-to-one, and sometimes it's hard, it's like there's like the title of that film, Lost in Translation. It's a kind of a good thing, but there's some things and there's certain nuances of certain words that's like, how do I get this across, and then there's also the ways languages are. Like German, for example, is a word that loves nominalizations. You can probably see these huge words, or like, the compound words that are all smashed together into one, for example. And I think that affects the way you think a little bit, but it made it extremely difficult to kind of, to translate things in a concise way that would all fit into a document, and look good in the grid, because it's like, okay. And then, so there are lots of different aspects there. And of course, there's also these different cultures and, different systems and so on. And that trying to translate those into ways that people in those systems and those cultures that are in there can understand it was extremely difficult. So,
Just
start with
fundamentally, right? Just fundamentally, like even the system of education where it's a track system, like you had said before, but like either not everybody's going to university, right? And we kind of already kind of determined that pretty early on in German education, right? Like it happens right about like 10th grade or something is where you start taking.
No, actually, so they track them in 5th grade already. So,
5th grade.
Wow.
5th grade. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, like this concept of having agency and designing to margins so that everybody has the access, both accessibility, big A, and access, little a. Like that's got to be difficult to translate culturally.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of different aspects that are fascinating there. I want to talk about, what I call the linguistic habitus, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
or habitus in Latin, right? So there's like the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu talked about this, right? But it basically means about like these deeply ingrained habits, skills, and dispositions, we possess due to our life experiences and professional backgrounds. So it's like a feel for the game that you have in a certain area you have, and there's different habitus that you can find. So like in U.S. pedagogical habitus, it's kind of like we kind of have flatter hierarchies, and things a little
Mm-hmm.
more informal. We kind of have like this kind of can-do attitude. Germany, is a very professional, kind of a little more static, kind of hierarchical, like
Yeah.
especially in terms of like education and academics and things like the scientific fields. There is this kind of tradition of, there's a high professor sitting up in the chair. He's the wise man in the room, or the wise, and then you're supposed to kind of just kind of listen, basically. So of course, it's a bit of an exaggeration. The things have kind of changed a little bit here, maybe, but it's still this distance is very much, it's much greater here between like instructor and student. Like when Thomas and I were translating this, we decided to use many languages, like, Luis, you speak Spanish, right? So,
Yes.
you have a formal address and an informal address with
Right.
you, right? So you have like tú and usted, right? And then in English, technically in English, we actually say, informal to everybody, thou, and nobody uses it anymore. So,
Right.
but
Right.
it doesn't have this, it doesn't have the same function as it used to, right? So for us, like, we can only create this distance by maybe saying sir, ma'am, and last name maybe, right? So things like that. But this is, of course, by just using this formal informal form, this creates a certain amount of distance here, or kind of a closeness. And things have changed recently in Germany, where this do form is used a lot more open, like much more quickly. But in the past, it was a lot, much more structural, hierarchical with that. However, like, we decided then, Thomas and I, we said, well, let's translate it into this do form then, right? The informal form. We thought that would be the most inclusive. It's kind of like in the vibe of, the guidelines, the 3.0 guidelines, and then we actually got some responses from people like in the Mint areas, right? So, the more science, the sciences like biology and so on. And they kind of felt like that wasn't appropriate, especially for like the higher level. A lot of them were working with university level students, things like that. And they kind of felt like, this poor polite address, this distancing was more academic. It showed more like an objectivity, in the scientific world, right? So,
Right. So
like, this distance,
being more formal equals more objectivity, which
exactly.
then
So it's more
means that
detached.
this has a scientific depth to it.
Complex thing where it's like it's not only the culture, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also the cultures in certain fields and domains that
Yeah.
you have that are there, right?
Whoa.
So we have to kind of think about that as well. We didn't think anybody would really have any issue with this, but now it's like, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess for them, it feels right, and for us, it feels right. So that's certainly a really interesting issue that was a challenge. It's a challenge for us, and now we have to think about what do we want to do in the future with this. Do we want to have it so there are like two versions? Where we have an informal and a formal one that people can
Right.
choose from. That would be kind of UDL like, right? So, but those are some of the questions we need to raise.
Yeah, I do love so in the show notes you put in this really great line that challenging the linguistic distance is in a way challenging core definition of what serious science looks like, and that raises some important questions. And that like UDL 3.0 and modern neuroscience actually challenges that distance of virtue or distance as a virtue. It suggests that affect and emotion are inseparable from learning process. And I think I wholeheartedly 100% agree with that. And that by removing that formal, you're attempting to acknowledge that the learner's sense of belonging and their emotional state are the very engines that drive cognitive processing. That I don't know if you've turned it into a paper yet, but this really interesting idea to me, right? That just even in our language speaks so deeply of culture, right? And the assumptions that lie within that, and that merely by changing the formality of you, right, it bridges this idea of belonging and the emotional state of the learner and the agency of the learner and where they sit. Is this learner focused? Is this not learner focused? I think that is we could probably go on for a 2-hour podcast just talking about the pieces of that language and what that means.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. It's really interesting work to me.
And you have to keep in mind, like when people are transitioning between cultures, we focus, because I am a multilingual learner myself. I came to the United States as a Spanish speaker, and like you said, we do have those formal and informal forms, but it determines so much the way that you relate to a faculty member or an elder.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it does, in some ways, determine the power relationships within a classroom. Right. So we say language is power. Literally, it's embedded. These power relations are embedded sometimes in the language that we use. Right. So I had a very difficult time when teachers in the US would say, refer to me as, like the more informal form, and I just could not get over the hump for a long time, because again, that was the way I was brought up, that like the teacher's the authority, and you kind of follow what they say and so on, where here, like, we're taught to be more critical and so on, and challenge some of those power relations. So but it's important, like you pointed out, you're not just translating in terms of just language, but you're translating across systems. So you got to make sure that it makes sense within. I love the word you use, habitus. I'm going to learn some Latin today.
Right. But it is deeply ingrained, right? Like it's just just by changing that small language change, it addresses so many systemic barriers and perceptions of barriers, right? And formality that exist in the system, in the educational system, which is, I just love it when something like that happens, when like we think this is a small change, but really what we're doing is we're actually just starting to pick at the seams of something very big. So
we also had this conversation with Louis Lord Nelson when we translated her UDL gears last year.
Yes.
And I had to use from time to time AI to translate and then check up with Stewart if this would fit. And it was very interesting how differently we saw some translations. Since he came from the States to Germany and learned German differently than I did. And I do work in Switzerland, where you use the formal and kind of never the informal speech. So it would be kind of strange if you would use this Z as listed in Spanish. This is why we realize it's maybe translation is one step to get access in German-speaking area. But on the other hand, we have to produce our own stuff in about the work people do in Germany or Switzerland or Austria or somewhere else. And because it's you won't ever find the perfect translation where everybody is happy with.
Right.
And we realized this when we got together in the network from different countries and even different regions in the countries, because it's totally different if you're from the north in Germany or in the south, and the educational system is also totally different, and Switzerland is the same. So you would struggle, and we thought it would be more effective with and this is one point I also wanted to talk about, like the handbook we are planning to write and to finalize in maybe autumn or winter next year. And we had a call of paper to collect all the great stuff that also already exists and bring together to make more known in our regions.
Yeah, and I think that it's an important distinction, right? And I think that it happens in our Spanish-speaking Latin countries as well. Is that it's not just as though like it is an accent change or a colloquial change. These are different countries, right? So and I know that we don't use DACH as much as we used to as a designation for German-speaking countries, because there's so many more, like Luxembourg and so forth. But these all have their own cultural pieces upon that, and they just happen to, they use German as a foundation, as a language. But even within that, there are cultural pieces within that. So then not only is it difference between North and South Germany, right, but it's difference between Austria and Switzerland. just like in Latin speaking countries, and not just northern Paraguay and southern Paraguay. It's also Peru and Paraguay. Like, what's the difference there? Like, it's just such an interesting. I don't know that translation actually fits what it really is that you're doing. You know
Yeah,
what I
well,
mean?
I, well, I think, Brian,
Right.
it comes down to like each country is going to be at a different point in the development of their school systems,
Right.
right? And
Exactly.
how it's organized, whether it's centralized.
Hmm.
Some countries have highly centralized systems. Here in the U.S., we have a much more decentralized, for better or for worse.
Yep. Right.
for
Exactly.
for for better in that you have a lot of local control over things, but at the same time, it can be a little bit chaotic. So taking that into consideration, right? We talked about the issue with translation, but tell us a little bit in terms of like the system. Is UDL something that's being sort of implemented more sort of top down, or is it kind of coming from the grassroots? Or, as we like to say, we love to see it when it's led from the middle, right? Where it's a little bit of both. So you have leadership that believes in it, right? And is pushing it as a policy. Because sometimes it takes somebody, to take the leap and kind of take the lead, if you will. But at the same time, sometimes it has to come from the grassroots, right? From the bottom up. So how are you seeing it in your context? And maybe we can start with you, Lukas.
Before I start answering your question, I just wanted to make one step back to the
Sure.
German-speaking areas, because last week we just realized it's totally Europe-centered, the way we thought when we ask for Austria or Switzerland and Luxembourg, because there's one example given also Namibia, where
Oh.
it's common to speak German, and we weren't thinking about this at all. So it's just one thing to add.
Yeah, that's good to be aware of that, right?
Yeah.
That we
Yeah.
need to make sure that we're considering everybody. When we say everybody,
Yeah.
it has to be everybody.
Yeah.
But there again, it goes back to our first point where we were talking about this idea that UDL seems very overwhelming at first, just in translation, right? Like, just in the translation piece, we have talked about several different countries, the cultural surroundings of those countries, the difficulty in translating that, and now we realize that we have maybe missed a country that we had no idea, that we really didn't kind of consider. But the beauty of it is that there's such flexibility in that we can go back and we can do the translation that we need to do there, or also make the acknowledgments that we need to make there. That to me is the amazing part. I'm sorry, please go ahead, Lukas.
Yeah, back to your question, Luis. Yeah, at the moment it's a bit of a mixed bag. Like it's not in the middle as it could be, but I would say it's primarily a grassroots movement. Although there are already some top-down guidelines on inclusion in Germany or Switzerland, but there is a big gap when it comes to putting them into practice. It is more like teachers or researchers who are bridging this gap by actively seeking UDL as a solution and bring it to the practice. And this is why we started this idea with our network to come from the middle. We have like researchers in our group, but also teachers. And maybe when we have our goal together, how we want to work, maybe we can like go to politics, because there also has to be like some changes that you can really like implement UDL in school system. And this is our idea. We want to like make the movement from isolated UDL islands, which like we have them at the moment, and this was like my big vision, to bring them together. And I would say this worked. We are now together, and now it's we have to find solutions. How can we work together and to bring all these great ideas together? But yes, we are making steps.
Yeah, it's almost like the idea of you have these nodes, right? Where you can have these little pockets of UDL that are very contextualized, right? And take into consideration the local realities, but then you kind of connect them, right? And through that connection, you can really start to share practices. And using UDL language, we can distribute the demands, right? So that it doesn't fall like on one person to do everything, but we have a network of people to rely on for ideas, for brainstorming, and for so on. So I love the idea of like a node a series of nodes that are connected. So that brings us to the network, right? And that's what you're trying to do, is create this idea of like a big brain with all these nodes connected with all these countries contributing their ideas, their local realities, and so on. But that's a massive undertaking, right? It takes a lot, and I'm so glad that the two of you are sort of, doing this work because it's really important to have people with vision and passion like yourselves doing it. But what's the biggest hurdles that you face? Because there are other parts of the world that may want to do something very similar, right? Again, taking into consideration their own realities, but what would you say is like a big hurdle that people need to consider in trying to build something like what you've done?
One hurdle is the distance between us. So we just had the possibility to meet online via Zoom or Teams or whatever. And this was the beginning. Like we had now 5 meetings, but we are planning to meet in person in November, I think, or October, here in Freiburg for the first time to make the big step to create the network officially. And the other maybe surprising hurdle was the administrative framework that we had to do. And I'd say the first 3 meetings were we missed up the power from time to time because we had to discuss many things, how we can bring all those different ideas and backgrounds together. And now we try to focus on our our goal, which brings us together, and which structures we need to work together from these different countries, regions, and to maybe create a stable house we can live in and work in. And the organization is tough.
Yeah, UDL gives us a lot of freedom, but sometimes we do need some structures too, right? I think, Brian, you've used the term bounded autonomy, right?
Right.
Where we have that freedom to let the work kind of develop on its own timeline, right? Rather than feeling rushed or feeling like it's too slow. But at the same time, we need to have those structures that guide us. So
yeah, absolutely. It's like you build a skeleton, right? The skeleton kind of gives support to the frame, right? And then muscle builds upon it, and your body takes shape. Your body might take a bunch of different shapes, right? And as you get older, your body takes a shape that maybe you don't love the most. But the skeleton kind of acts as like this formation, right? And that's kind of how I've seen like you guys putting together this organization. You are growing the skeleton of the organization right now, which will add the frame, and then the frame develops in these unique ways and brings these nodes together. And it's not an easy task. In fact, it might feel like sometimes you're trying to ice skate uphill. You know what I mean? Like it's just super. It's a slog sometimes because you want to give it the freedom that it deserves to grow, but you also have to have these administrative kind of pieces in there, right? And it's always going to be a war between those. And I think that bounded autonomy of like you can do all of these things within this space. Like these are definitely the final constraints. I think it's the most honest way for us to build those organizations.
And it may feel like sometimes, you're not moving along on the vision, because you're like, you're doing all these administrative things. But remember those administrative things, they're part of the work, right? Yep. You are creating the structures that will make the work sustainable and so on. So how about you, Stewart? What have you seen as like some of the biggest challenges in doing this work?
Well, I definitely have to agree with Lukas that I think we underestimated the administrative work that goes along with it. Mm-hmm. I would kind of make the comparison with what, I was talking to a professor recently, and she was telling me how she got into her position. She said she also didn't realize that there was so much administrative work that goes along with that position, writing grant things, and then you got to sign contracts for your student assistants, and then you got to, put this, thing in to pay for that and so on. And then she kind of feels like she does more of that than she actually does her core job is real teaching,
Yeah.
And in some ways I can understand. I think for us it's a little bit of a drag because like it's not the most fun thing to do in the world, right? So, but on the other hand, like you said, Luis, it's this very critical aspect, Brian, you got this skeleton that's there that's important. And maybe the second thing is a bit tricky is that even though we all share this common interest and passion for UDL, we all come from very diverse backgrounds. I mean, of course, I teach some history, but I'm primarily a language teacher, right? But we also have people from like the Mint area. We have people who are special educational areas. So we all kind of have our own reasons for being there. And sometimes, we have also diverging interests, what we want to do with it and so on. And then, so like I'm not, it's a double-edged thing. It's like diversity is good, but it's also a bit tricky sometimes. And so, yeah, I think that's another issue there. It's just in terms of, trying to find where do we have, what do we share a common element or common visions then in this case, and how can we make that grow in our organization?
Yeah.
So everybody
what becomes the
benefits from it.
core, right? What becomes our core beliefs that we can all, because having divergent idea, I think that's, when building structures and systems, having divergent outlooks and divergent outcomes that you want to see happen, that's okay. But what is the converging piece? What is the thing, the core, the system, the one through line that connects us, right? And coming back to that. And one of the beauties of having diverse folks get together is that it will always challenge what we believe our converging through line is, which makes us re-examine it, makes our system stronger by doing so. I'm tuning in from another part of the world, and I think that we address this a little bit. Somebody else is saying, you know what, I really need a network in, I don't know, I need a network in Southeast Asia. What are like, from both of you, what are maybe the top 3 things that you can give them as far as like advice? How can people currently working, and then let's follow it up with how people are currently working in German-speaking worlds can kind of hook up with you. But if I'm in a different country, what are the top 3 things that you would give as advice for me to start my own network? And Stewart, you hit us first, man.
Sure, man. Let's see. I would definitely say you first, just like kind of Lukas did. I mean, Thomas and I were talking like, we were saying, it would be kind of cool to have some sort of network here in Germany, but we were always kind of like, we got too much to do. And then we were just kind of lucky that Lukas came by and, he was already kind of doing this work of, well, he was kind of, he was networking people together. And then we kind of said, let's do this then. Right. So I think that you finding that first batch of motivated people just to get the ball rolling. It's like first gear in a car. It's hard, but like once you get into second gear, things start rolling.
Yeah.
And that's important.
Love that metaphor.
Yes.
Right. So, and then,
And leave it to a special education guy. Special education guy gets in there, gets it done. A former special ed teacher myself.
Yeah, and then we also have to. If we talk about the administrative things, we're kind of all learning on the go. Like most of us don't know. Like here we are thinking about legal forms. Are we a club? Are we this? So on. And then we also Switzerland doesn't belong to the EU, so that's another tricky legal. So you always have to kind of think about that. But a lot of times it's like it's a learning journey that we're all doing together, and then we try to through our collective power, and we're a bunch of wonderful individuals with lots of qualities and skills that are there. I think make sure that you guys then tap into that power that you have, collective power there. And then of course, we talked about this at the beginning of our thing. I said, we have got this Tuckman's model of the stages of group development, right? Like it's forming, storming, norming, performing. And I always kind of thought like, oh yeah, whatever. But actually, you actually do kind of see things like this. And, especially the forming and storming, it's like, oh, and then, we're trying to see who's going to say what, who's going to take over this task and so on. And then, so, use that as a way of also reflecting on the group development. I think that would be a couple points I would bring in there. So,
yeah, taking a look at Tuckman's work, I think is pretty massive, right? Especially in the beginning, forming and storming. Know that there is going to be upheaval that happens. Right. And be okay with that, because it is part of the stage, right? Like as you're forming, everybody's got the same idea. That's really cool, blah, blah, blah. And then next thing you know, like next Tuesday, that one of the key people is no longer part of it, or they have a divergent thought. That's okay. right? That's where you want to be, because that's how you get to that phase of norming, of saying, these are the things that we believe in. This is our through line. This is what we're trying to establish. And then it's only after that that you can really put together the things that you want to perform and you want to grow. Yeah, I think Tuckman's model is fantastic for a beginning network.
And how about you, Lucas, if you had to give like one piece of advice?
I can't add that much. I think like you have to be patient and brave till you get your goal together. And I think once you have found your goal where you work together, you have to go step by step.
Well, I think
if you bring those three things together, it will work.
Yeah, and we mentioned with UDL all the time, keep the goal in mind, right? Because that's what's we kind of relating it to our learners, right? Keeping the goal in mind is what's going to get you through the things that are a slog.
Like that's the administrative things. Like to find the goal. I would say this is like the most difficult part, to find the goal sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's time well spent, right? It's time well spent coming up with a clear goal, because that's going to drive everything. And like I said, it's going to help you persist when things get tough. But also, I guess, bringing it back to sports, because right now is the NBA playoffs, and there's a player on the Sixers, Joel Embiid, and they call him the process, right? Because it took some time for him to kind of develop into the player that he is. And so one of the sayings is, trust the process.
Yep.
It's going to happen. It may not happen right away, but you just have to trust the process. And if you develop these structures, and it's kind of like you have to go slow to go fast. Yeah. It may seem like you're going slow at first, but you're laying down the groundwork that's kind of going to help things take off at some point. Like there's going to be this tipping point where all that work that you're doing that seems like it's really not moving the gears all that much, at some point, to use your metaphor, sir, because I love metaphors, the gears are going to catch and everything's just going to move so efficiently.
Yeah, and I think it harkens back to that idea, that theory around hard fun, right? Like it's something that is exhausting. But when you look at it, and if somebody said, would you do it again? You'd go, yeah, I'd probably do it again. I might change some things, but I would do it again, because the purpose and the intent is so incredibly needed, right? And powerful, but also like this process, while tiring, it was a good process. It really stretched me. It really stretched my thoughts, and I met some great people along the way. You know what I mean? Like I think that those things are, you can't really discount that. I think that's an important thing that drives us.
The people is key, right? You have to find
this is a human endeavor.
Yeah, some good people, right? To be able to do this work that are committed. So just to wrap up here, let's put on like a magic hat,
right?
And think about 3 years from now, where do you see this going? Where would you like to see it? Again, going back to that vision that kind of keeps us going. So let's start with you, Stewart.
Well, I think with this kind of organization, regular meetings is important, right? Because I was on another network, professional network recently, that was kind of related to a similar topic, but only in the EFL area. And, at the beginning we met every couple months, but now I feels like I haven't even seen anybody for a year and a half or something like that. And it's just kind of petered out. And so I think, setting that time aside and saying, okay, look, it's, like you said, it's a bit more work, and I don't get paid. I don't have any research money, so it's just for me, for extra professional development,
right,
on the side. But it's like, no, it's important to me, so I'm going to set out that and make time for it. So yeah, I think having these regular meetings, whether of course the online ones, and then maybe trying to find some sort of space where we can meet in person, maybe annually or biannually, depending on what we have there. We also hopefully we can network with other various actors in the field, right? Whether it be with other groups that maybe form around the world, or here in our local contexts, right, where we're working maybe with individuals in educational systems, universities and things like that, where we might be able to come in as people maybe have some expert kind of knowledge or something like that, or people we can, they can, interact with. Those are a couple of ideas. I think Lukas also has some really good ideas we talked about recently, right, Lukas?
Yes, I think one big thing would be like a platform or a web page or something where we can share our ideas, materials, experience about UDL. and to make it accessible and open source for everyone. And the other big thing would be the publication, which hopefully comes next year. And this will also be open.
This is the book project, right?
Yes, which will also be like open access. So,
I love it.
That's important.
Yeah,
this will be great.
And it will be in German, right? So that's where we're trying to work in within that field. So maybe one of the things I can wrap up with, I was talking to a guy named Rich Powers, who's also an American guy here teaching with UDL at the university level in Stuttgart, and he told us that he said once the UDL guidelines were like kind of available in Germany, he showed them to his students, even though they're all mostly working in EFL area, like it just clicked. So like even though the translations are not perfect, it still was a step towards making it more accessible to them.
Yeah, well, and I think that Stewart, that's one of my favorite parts about the UDL quote unquote family, right? Like the UDL crew. I don't know what we want to call us, but that you can put out things that are not perfect. And you can say, this is an iteration, and we are open to iterating further on it. And that people will come around and be like, there's something really useful about this. Like, we've seen it with tons of different things. We've seen it with the UDL blueprint from the IRN back in the day. We've seen it, Louis' podcast is amazing at highlighting pockets of innovation that are happening. Like, that is one of the beauties about the UDL movement internationally. Is that it really at its core is about innovation and understanding that this isn't the end. This is a process that we work through as we build things. It's one of my favorite pieces of the UDL movement.
Yeah, and just to wrap us up, there are lots of opportunities. One of the things that we do at CAS is be a convener, right? So like I mentioned earlier in the podcast episode, we do have UDLCon Live where people like Stewart and Lukas can meet each other in person, and sometimes over a couple of beverages of whatever kind you like.
That's right.
You can
drill or so.
Yeah, you can sketch out, some of these ideas, and you can make a lot of progress sometimes when you meet in person, because it does build those relationships, right, on which this work really builds. And of course, we have a UDL community that you can join, and wouldn't it be nice to have a section of that UDL community in German? For German speakers, right? Yep. So I'm just putting that out as an idea.
And you can find that on our site, but it's a Mighty Networks platform, and so it's a virtual place where we can build. And
I'm just part of it.
I'm sorry.
Perfect. Yeah. Lukas is part of it already, so perfect.
Yeah. You're part of the. I think I've seen you in the AI community as well, right? And so we have quite a few different communities within our space. And our UDLCon International event online is July 21st to the 22nd. So, you know what? Here's my shameless plug. You can still go get some tickets. We got to give a few shameless plugs there, Luis, to keep the lights on and pay the bills. You know what I mean? There's rent due sometimes. You know what I mean? I don't mean nobody knocking on my door.
Absolutely.
So that's still going on. Make sure you check it out, July 21st, 22nd. And by the way, just gentlemen, I just want to tell you both, if you are looking for two bearded dudes who have passports that are up to date to come out to one of your convenings, I might know some. I might be able to hip you to some folks.
I would love to go back for sure.
We definitely got some really good liquid refreshments here in Germany that you might enjoy.
Right. For sure. Right. And Brian already has me thinking about the chocolate cake. So forest cake. So, but to wrap us up, thank you so much, Lukas and Stewart. I really appreciate the work that you're doing to really spread the love and get UDL adopted, and thinking about it with a lot of passion. And a lot of drive, and we're so excited to see where it goes, and whatever we can do to support you in this endeavor of keeping this going, because I think it's going to really bear fruit. And like I said, trust the process; it will happen.
That's right. And I just have to ask you, like, if somebody is they're engaging in UDL practice, and they're like, wait a minute, and they're in a German-speaking country, and they're like, wait a minute, I had no idea that these two, that these four individuals or this many individuals are trying to build this network. How do they get in touch with you?
We are working on creating a platform, but this is one of the administrative hurdles we have to remove.
Yeah. So there's
LinkedIn
on the way, but hit you up on LinkedIn. We'll put that in the show notes for sure.
Absolutely.
That way, we can get you to a place where you're getting inundated on your LinkedIn with people who are like, wait a minute, we needed this, right? So I'm excited to see how it progresses. Gentlemen, I just want to say thank you for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
And as always, peace, love, and belly rubs, y'all.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Learning Experience Podcast. We are so glad you're a part of this conversation.
And if you're like me and today's episode sparked some ideas or got your brain flowing, well, just remember there's so much more to explore out there.
And remember that CAST is leading the way when it comes to accessibility, workforce innovation, professional development, and research.
So visit cast.org to dive deeper. That's CAST.org, and keep learning with us.